You sometimes ever wonder why humans act the way humans do? Or why humans have to be such complex creatures with different opinions which totally don't make sense and aren't as good as mine, of course? Well, ladies and gentlemen, if you fall into that category of people with questions and not enough answers, then I have the treat for you. Today, we're going to be looking at the Neuroscientific Obscure Oddities Iceberg, created by Blake Sama. We're going to be figuring out how our brain truly works and how different people see the world in different lenses. Let's dive straight into the Neuroscientific Obscure Oddities Iceberg. The brain is pretty straightforward. It's essentially the most important organ in your body. It's what we essentially are. It's the organ that is in charge of the other organs. Neurons are cells that are responsible for sending signals and commands. Neurons are these tiny cells that are in our brains, and they send commands and signals to other parts of the body, essentially. Glia are cells that are responsible for helping moderate neurons. They're essentially like neurons' older brother. They're just there to help the neurons regulate. Neuroscience is the study of the brain and the nervous system, and it is the main focus of this iceberg. Neuroscience studies how the brain works and interacts with different body parts. We'll learn more about this later. Illusions are things that distort the senses. For example, look at this optical illusion right here. It seems like it's moving, but it's actually not. Auditory illusions are also a type of illusion, but it's not just visual and auditory illusions that are a thing. Even senses like our taste or our touch, and even our smell can all be manipulated to some extent. Awareness is, again, another pretty self-explanatory one. It's essentially the world that our brain creates. It's our processing system that we create through our senses and through our thinking. A reflex is an involuntary sudden action. For example, oh, I just caught my phone. That right there was a reflex. I just did something without even thinking about it. Reflexes are biologically programmed into our brains. Again, this should be pretty self-explanatory. A neurodegenerative disease is a type of disease that affects stuff like neurons. Essentially, symptoms of neurodegenerative disease tend to include a loss of hearing, a loss of vision, a loss of intellect, something a lot of people have nowadays, and even stuff like losing your ability to speak. And even stuff like losing your ability to speak or having seizures can all be common symptoms of a neurodegenerative disease. Neurodegenerative diseases that are pretty well known include Parkinson's, Huntington's, and Alzheimer's. Neuropsychology is essentially a branch of psychology that focuses on how people's brains are working, essentially. Neuropsychiatry is very similar to neuropsychology. However, the key difference is that neuropsychiatry uses actual psychiatry to try and figure out people's cognitive behaviors and help them, essentially. Neurolinguistics is the scientific study of how our brain handles language, like writing, reading, listening, etc. Neuroimaging refers to the use of technology to help map out our brain. For example, MRI scans. I think we all know what an MRI scan looks like. And that's exactly what it is. It's a scan that is used to help map out your brain. That's what neuroimaging is all about. Neurodiversity is essentially a term used to describe how everybody's brain tends to operate different from each other. There are no two brains on this planet that have the exact same thought process. were all different. A lobotomy was this bizarre procedure that was used commonly in the 60s, 70s, and 80s-ish, kind of, in which an ice pick normally was shoved up into your eye, into the frontal cortex, or prefrontal cortex as it's called. And essentially what they would do is they would move the ice pick around and cut off like certain parts of the brain and connections to it. And it was a really macabre, weird surgery that was apparently used to help treat schizophrenia. But all I ended up doing was changing people's sense of reality forever. Never. Ever. Trepanation is very similar to lobotomy, but it's like a more ancient version of lobotomy that was used during like the medieval era. Essentially what it was that somebody would drill a hole into your, like the back of your brain, right? Or the back of your skull. And it was used to help like relieve pressure and to help like with like mental diseases. And apparently speaking, it could even help locate and assess brain tumors. Camillo Golgi, I think I'm pronouncing that right, was an Italian biologist that was really crucial towards neuroscience. He helped discover this thing called the Golgi apparatus, which if you've ever taken biology class, you know what I'm talking about. The Golgi apparatus is an organelle that packages proteins into membrane-bound vessels. He helped discover that. Oh, and he also won a Nobel Prize in 1906. Dyslexia is a learning disability in which people have a hard time writing, reading, and spelling out words. Someone with dyslexia might see this word as whatever the hell this is. Essentially, a learning disability. Disability to make fat stacks. REM sleep, or otherwise known as rapid eye movement sleep, is a period of sleep in which stuff like rapid eye movement, as the name implies, more dreaming and a faster heart rate start to happen. Essentially speaking, REM sleep is like the last stage of the sleep cycle, if you know what I'm referring to. It's the part of sleep where shit gets real. Classical conditioning is a type of conditioning which is used to condition people into having positive emotions to otherwise neutral things. Pavlov's dogs are a great example of this, but I can even give you a better example in modern times. When they were doing the trials for the Neuralink chip, they would essentially put a monkey playing a video game, and whenever the monkey scored in the video game, he would get a reward, some sort of nutrient or something, I don't know, banana Slurpee, I don't know. And essentially speaking, the monkey was conditioned to believing that scoring a point would have real life physical benefit. So if you want to turn monkeys into modern warfare sweats, classical conditioning is the way to go. And that's it for stage 1 of the iceberg. Let's move on to stage 2. The Tyrian brain is essentially a theory created by Paul D. MacLean in the 1960s. The Tyrian brain is essentially a map charting out the evolution of vertebrate beings. The Tyrian brain presents 3 stages in the evolution of the vertebrate brain. Number 1 being the reptilian complex, in charge of instinct. Number 2 being the paleomammalian complex, in charge of emotions. And number 3 being the neomammalian complex, in charge of logic. And essentially speaking, what Mr. MacLean is trying to say here is that we have reached the 3rd stage of vertebrate evolution when it comes to our brain. We are at the stage in which we are logical and can use stuff like language to help reason. This is considered kind of a pseudoscience, but also kind of true to some extent. It's debatable. Neuroanthropology is the study of how culture impacts the brain, specifically language and essentially cultural and sociological behavior. Neurophysics is the use of physics and physical scientific methods used in order to help study the nervous system and the brain. Neurocomputing is the use of computers and computing to help understand neuroscience. For example, stuff like computer simulations, stuff like mathematical models, stuff like mathematical research in terms of computers can all help in this field of study. Neurobiomechanics is exactly how it sounds. It is the use of neuroscience to help understand how certain mechanics operate inside a human and an animal. Neurobiomechanics is really helpful during surgical procedures. Homunculus is a weird one. It's essentially a 2D map used to describe which areas of the brain operate which body parts or which senses. There's even a 3D homunculus, which if you Google it, you will find some of the most bizarre things ever. And essentially speaking, it's a way of visually representing what senses are more important. A neurochip is a chip that is used to help upgrade and interact with your brain. For example, Elon Musk's Neuralink, that's the perfect example that it can give you of a neurochip. John Evangelista Porcunier, I think that's how you pronounce it, was a Czech anatomist and physiologist. He coined the term protoplasma in 1839, and he invented Purkinje cells and fibers. He was a very famous scientist for the time. In fact, he was so famous, that when people from outside of Europe would write letters towards him, all they would write would be Purkinje, Europe, instead of writing the actual city name he was in. Neuroaesthetics explores the concepts of aesthetics, aka color, form, shape, anything relating to media and music and art and the qualities that come with it. And it explains how our brain reacts to certain things. Neurosociology is the study of finding out how our brain reacts to certain social situations. Again, pretty self-explanatory. Neurokime is the kinetic energy that is released from a neural activity. That's literally all it says on Merriam-Webster. Neurophilosophy is, again, pretty self-explanatory. It's basically a type of philosophy that tends to focus more on neuroscience type of things such as free will, consciousness, and the self. Neuro-linguistic programming, the first of the pseudoscience ones. Now this one is very interesting. It was brought up by two people named Richard Grandler and John Grinder in the book The Structure of Magic 1. It tries to paint a picture that there is a connection between the brain, language, and behavioral patterns. And that only through neuro-linguistic programming, essentially a methodology of using things to rewire your brain and to teach your brain into letting go of certain things, kind of like CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy. It's essentially a way of curing every type of disease imaginable. Whether it be phobias, depression, allergies, the common cold, it doesn't matter. NLP can do it all. Dyscalculia is a disability that essentially prevents somebody from learning mathematical arithmetic, aka math with numbers, easily. It's a learning disability when it comes to numbers, essentially. Neuroexistentialism, which is very similar to neurophilosophy, is exactly what the name says. It's a type of neuroscience that deals with existentialism. Trust me, they're not all gonna be like this. Okay, here we have another one. Neurocardiology. Neurocardiology is essentially a study of how the brain interacts with the heart. Neurology is the study of dreams, and what certain dreams mean, and how we can interpret them, and how our brain can shape dreams. Edward Friedrich Wilhelm Flügger was a German physiologist. He essentially discovered Flüger's law, which is essentially how electrical stimulation can correlate to muscle contraction. He also did research on the nervous system, and he even got elected to a Nobel Prize in 1908, which he lost. He really couldn't pull a Nobel Prize like our boy Camilo Golgi did. Psychoanalysis is a set of therapeutical treatments in which a person is told to let go of their past. Essentially speaking, psychoanalysis focuses on how the past can affect the present and how you're feeling, and it tries to help alleviate certain stresses from the past. 10% of the brain is used. This is complete bullshit. 10% of the brain isn't being used at any time. We actually tend to use all of our brain even to perform the simplest of tasks. This was a myth that was kind of popularized by two scientists by the name of Will James and Boris Sidis. Funny enough, their student was William Sidis, who is the smartest man ever live. So yeah, we only use 10% of our brain is a myth. Although with the amount of stupidity there is nowadays, I don't even know anymore. On to stage number 3. Neurogenetics. Again, like the name implies, it's a type of neuroscience that focuses on how genetics impacts the brain and the nervous system. Neurohistory, again, pretty self-explanatory. It's looking back at history and using new neurological discoveries to figure out why people did the batshit crazy insane stuff they did. Synesthesia is a condition in which one of our senses gets mixed up with the other. So this is going to be hard to explain, but for example, let's grab the months of the year. Somebody with synesthesia could subconsciously associate a color with a specific month, or a month with a specific color. For example, some people January might be light green, maybe December is dark blue, maybe July is yellow. Not only can it be months, it could also be names, could be people, could be letters, could be numbers. And it's not just that, it could be anything, it could be any sense crossing over with any other sense. It could be sight with hearing, could be smelling with tasting, it can be anything. Schizophrenia is a really horrible disease, and the big disease that everybody talks about when it comes to neurological type disease, in which a person experiences episodes of psychosis. So stuff like delusions, stuff like paranoia, stuff like hallucinations, both visual and auditory. It's a really dangerous disease that can lead to depression and even people killing themselves. It's a disease that causes constant hallucinations. Neuroarchaeology is a very weird term to describe using archaeology to help discover stuff relating to neuroscience, or vice versa. Neuropolitics, blah blah blah. It's the study of how neuroscience can impact people's political decisions. Neurolaw, same thing. It's using neuroscience to help laws, or how laws can be changed by people. Neurology's same shit. Mind-body dualism is interesting. It's essentially a theory that states that the body and the mind are two separate beings, and that the mind is non-physical, whereas the body itself is a physical thing that is separate from the mind. If you really like this idea, you should look into Descartes, because he gets brought up a lot when mind-body dualism is mentioned. Okay, pronounce this with me. Magnetoencephalography, or aka MEG, is a neuroimaging technique used to record magnetic fields produced by electrical currents in the brain. I'll show you a photo of what it looks like. Effective computing is the study of developing and coming up with devices that can help study neuroscience. Essentially computer science mixed with neuroscience. Clinical lycanthropy is a disease in which somebody believes that they are either transforming into an animal or that they are an animal. And symptoms of this can include believing that certain animalistic features are growing on your body, barking like a dog, and even walking on all fours. So yes, being a furry is literally a medical disease that has been diagnosed and confirmed as being real. Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease, also known as mad cow disease, is a disease in which your brain starts to deteriorate rapidly. It's basically a never-ending stream of brain damage, to the point where a person can even be put in a coma. Any symptom can happen because of this disease. Any neurological symptom can happen because it is destroying your brain from the inside. Neuroethics is either one of two things. It's the neuroscience surrounding why we do certain ethical things, or it's the ethical things that we do when we study neuroscience. It's one of the two things. Pick your poison. Neuroculture, which is similar to neuroanthropology, is the study of neurology and culture. That's getting boring at this point. Apophenia is interesting. It's essentially a type of mental disorder in which you can find patterns in things that aren't really there. So for example, let's just say you and a friend are out somewhere and y'all are laying down and looking up at the clouds above. And let's just say that somebody with apophenia finds a cloud that looks kind of like a skull. Doesn't mean anything. But to a person with apophenia, that could mean big trouble, because they might see a skull as a sign that they might die, or something else. It's a type of paranoia when it comes to finding patterns in objects. Although that would be kind of weird to find a full light cloud, not gonna lie. Neurotheology is explaining why people have certain faiths and beliefs and certain religious experiences through neuroscience. Face blindness, aka presopagnosia, I have no idea how the hell you even say that, is a type of disorder where people have a hard time remembering people's faces, including their own. That is stage 3 of the iceberg. That's all we're gonna do for today.